My name is Eleanor Mayfield, and I am 78 years old. I have lived long enough to see joy, sorrow, betrayal, and even miracles. But nothing, prepared me for the humiliation I suffered at my own daughter's wedding. It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, and perhaps mine too. My only child, Clarissa, stood in the church in a beautiful ivory dress that made her look like an angel. Tears welled in my eyes as I thought of the little girl I raised all by myself after my husband passed away. I had scrubbed floors, worked late shifts at diners, and walked miles in the rain to keep food on the table for her. And now, here she was, glowing under the stained glass windows, saying, "I do," to a man who would later prove himself to be nothing but a wolf hiding in a tuxedo. His name was Damien Cole. On the outside, he was charming, well-dressed, polite, even generous. He came from a family that looked respectable, though I always felt there was a coldness in his eyes that others ignored. Clarissa insisted I was being old-fashioned whenever I tried to express my doubts. She told me love had changed him. I wanted to believe her. The ceremony ended, and everyone rushed to the reception hall, decorated with golden drapes and silver chandeliers. Laughter filled the air. Glasses clinked. People danced. And for a short while, I felt proud. Proud of the woman my daughter had become. Proud that I had raised her alone. Proud that we had made it this far. But then it happened. I was seated at the family table when Damien walked over, his face red from too much champagne. He leaned close and whispered harshly in my ear, "You will learn your place in this family, old woman." At first, I thought he was joking. My heart froze when I realized he wasn't. I tried to step away from him, but before I could, his hand struck across my face, hard. A sharp sting burned my cheek. The sound echoed through the room. Gasps filled the hall as every guest turned to look. I staggered back, clutching the edge of the table for balance. My soul cracked inside me. I wasn't just being beaten, I was being beaten in front of hundreds of people, friends, family, strangers. And then, what cut deeper than the slap itself, was my daughter's voice. "Mom," Clarissa hissed, her face twisted in annoyance rather than concern. "Please, shut up and sit down. You're embarrassing me." The room spun. My knees trembled. My own flesh and blood, my only child, was siding with him. With the man who had just raised his hand against me. I don't know how I stayed upright. I don't know how I didn't collapse right there. But I swallowed my tears, I sat back in my chair, and I let the music drown the silence. People tried to pretend nothing had happened. They laughed louder, clinked glasses harder, danced wilder. But I couldn't hear any of it. All I could hear was my daughter's words. "Shut up and sit down." That night, as the celebration carried on, I made a vow inside my heart. A vow I never thought I'd have to make against my own child and her husband. If they thought they could humiliate me, silence me, and break me, they were wrong. They didn't know who they were dealing with. I had fought poverty, loneliness, and grief for decades. I was not going to let my twilight years be ruled by fear. So I sat quietly at that wedding table, smiling politely at anyone who dared meet my eyes. But in my mind, I was already planning. And before the night ended, I had decided. They would pay. I would strip everything from them until they learned what it felt like to have nothing. Not tomorrow. Not next week. That very night. If you felt Eleanor's heartbreak and rage, stay with me, because what happens next will leave you speechless. This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of revenge, survival, and justice. My name is Eleanor Mayfield. I am 78 years old, and I have been alive long enough to know when a quiet little plan needs to become a revolution. After Damien's hand hit my face in the reception hall, something in me went very, very still. The music swelled and people danced like the world hadn't changed in the 2 seconds my cheek burned. My daughter's voice, the soft, polished voice of the woman I raised, cut through that noise like a knife. "Shut up and sit down," she said, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. I sat. But my mind was already moving like a thing that had been prepared for a long time. "You have to understand something about me. I was never reckless. I was poor once, in a deep, grinding way that taught me the difference between want and need. I learned to hide pennies in odd places. I learned to say no to dresses and yes to overtime shifts. When the bank stopped taking people's stories at face value, I learned to turn my pennies into papers, my small savings into evidence. Receipts, deeds, names written on the back of envelopes. If life had taught me one favor, it was this: to plan for storms. Clarissa always thought she'd inherited nothing but my stubbornness. She never knew that I had spent 3 decades building a small fortress for the two of us. A modest Cape Cod on Maple Hollow Drive with blue shutters and a pear tree that used to host neighborhood birds like a gospel choir. I had bought that house when she was 6, after my diner closed and before I started the night cleaning job at the hospital. People called it luck that a widow could afford a mortgage. I called it discipline. I had paid and paid and paid, sometimes from tips, sometimes from overtime, and sometimes from the little envelopes where I stashed $1 here and $5 there. The house was mine. The mortgage had been wiped clean 10 years ago, and my name, Eleanor June Mayfield, was the only name on the deed. When Clarissa and Damien asked if they could move in until they saved up, of course I said yes. I had held out this blue house like a promise. Stay, child. Build. Don't be foolish. And they moved in, they painted the hallway a color I didn't like, and they began to speak of our mortgage, as if ownership flowed from the mouth. Ownership, I had learned, is a word with many faces. The legal one, paper and stamp, was mine. But the sentimental one belongs to the one who believes they have it. Belief, I discovered, can be an even more dangerous thing than law. So when I sat in that gilded reception hall, the vow I made, make them pay, was not some sudden act of fury. It was the activation of a long-waiting plan. If a thing belongs to you on paper, you can take it back in practice. Not with violence. Not with desperation. With quiet, legal precision and the help of a few good people who remembered what I once did for them. The first person I called was Margot. She's an old friend from the hospital, worked nights alongside me when the world was asleep. Her name isn't common, and neither is her courage. She answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, are you still at the reception?" she asked, calm as the night shift. "Yes," I said. My voice was small, but steady. "Get to Maple Hollow. Bring boxes. Bring Len." There was a noise on the other end, like a breath. "You can't be serious. Get in the car." Len was the building superintendent from the small complex where my sister used to live. He was a gentleman named Lenton Pierce who had a heart like a storm drain. He took in what the city tried to wash away. He owed me favors. Margot and Len both owed me small things from those long nights when I'd helped cover a shift and cooked soup for a sick nurse. In my life, favors sit in a ledger as well as mortgage payments. They are called back at times that matter. I left the reception through the kitchen door while the DJ switched songs. Clarissa danced with her cousins. Damien laughed at a joke someone else made. No one thought to look for me that fast. I walked to my car with the same limp I had when I walked home from the diner after a double shift. My hands were steady. I had never felt steadier. The drive to Maple Hollow was short. The air that night was cool enough to prickle the skin. The streetlights threw soft halos on the pavement. When I pulled up behind the house I had once painted with Clarissa's small hands, her fingers sticking to the brush, the sun setting like an orange coin, weeping in my memory, I felt both a mother and a chess player. Len was already there, sleeves rolled, toolbox at his feet. Margot had brought cardboard boxes and a large duffel bag. A neighbor with a pickup, a man named Tobias Finch, an uncommon name and an uncommon generosity, waited at the curb. We were a small, odd army of people who knew that small acts of kindness become defiance when someone you love is humiliated. They were loud inside, music droning, guests staggering into cars, the laughter of people for whom the rest of the world had not collapsed. I could hear Damien's voice, easy, honeyed, telling someone about a business plan. He had that way, the kind that wraps itself around other people's trust. I walked up the porch steps beneath the light that had once hung crooked after a storm and now shone like an accusation. My key fit neatly into the lock. There are small reassurances in life. A key sliding into place is one of them. When the door opened, the sight was almost absurd. Clarissa in her wedding dress, still pinned with a corsage that had started to wilt, talking to an old college friend. Damien stood with a glass in his hand and an expression that should have been contentment. He looked toward me as if surprised a ghost had stepped into the party. Eleanor. Clarissa's voice was a small thing, the way one sounds when they are caught at a secret. Damien's smile went flat. "What are you doing here?" he said. The question had a possession to it, like a man asking why a tenant had come into the apartment the landlord owned. I stepped in without saying anything. "I live here," I said. The words fell like small pebbles, but they were stones in a wall. "You live." The confusion on Clarissa's face was almost comical. She had spent the night pretending she had never been sick with a scraped knee and a mother who kissed it all better. She had turned my past into a cautionary tale she no longer needed. Damien looked at me, then at the floor, then at the cigarette-stained cushions of the couch. "This is our home," he said finally. "It's my house," I answered. "The deed says so." I reached for my purse and set a small, thick envelope on the kitchen counter. "You two signed a lease with your names on the rental agreement 3 years ago. I was supporting you. I paid for upgrades. I had hoped you'd be honest about that. But since honesty seems costly at this wedding, then fine. You can leave tonight. I've already called Len. He'll help you move." Clarissa's face crumpled the way a napkin does when you squeeze it. "Mom, this is insane." "Is it?" I asked. "Is it more insane than a man hitting an old woman at a wedding and his wife asking that old woman to be quiet?" For a second they were both speechless. Then Damien reached for the phone. "I'm calling the police," he said, but his hand shook. Len and Tobias began the business of moving with quiet efficiency. Margot sat with me at the kitchen table and placed a thermos in my hand like an anchor. "You always said you'd rather people remember your backbone than your silence," she whispered. I thought of all the nights I had told Clarissa stories of survival. I thought of the pear tree out back and how its branches had held our secrets. That house had raised us. It had sheltered us. It had been my sacrifice and my sanctuary. No one had the right to strike me beneath a chandelier and expect tidiness afterward. The neighbors came in small groups, drawn by the spectacle. Some looked sympathetic to me. Others looked at Damien with curiosity as if he were the tragic hero of a story he had not yet learned to play. My heart thudded. I felt adrenaline like coffee, bitter and awake. Clarissa begged. She begged in a small voice that used to belong to the child who wanted the moon from a jar. "Mom, please. Don't do this. We'll sort it out. We'll. You will sort it out with honesty," I said. "And you will start by taking everything you brought in here. My name is on the deed. Your names are on the lease. So take what is yours and leave before the police make it a civil matter." He stood rooted, then angry. He stormed to the front door and began to shout that he would call the police, and that no one could just come in and throw their things onto the lawn. He slammed the door as police cruisers approached, because someone had seen them arguing in the street and had called. Clarissa followed him, white-faced and trembling. The police came and stood like men who have read this book before. They said it was a civil matter and that they could not force a re-entry. Laws have a way of cushioning rage with slow processes. They are written to avoid midnight drama and to prefer paperwork to pitched battles. The officer took statements, nodded seriously, and told Damien they would note the complaint. They left. I remember watching them walk away and feeling older than my years and younger than my courage. I had not wanted to be vindictive, only to be acknowledged. I had not wanted to tear a daughter away from a life for which she had so richly yearned. But a wife who says, "Shut up and sit down," while her husband raises his hand, makes choices when the door is closed. I could not be expected to accept their choices with a smile. By the time the pickup left with the couple's mattresses and mismatched lamps, the street smelled of cut grass and gasoline. The headlights from the last car that drove away blinked like a bad conscience. I sat on the porch steps until morning light hardened the sky. People passed by and offered condolences, or gossip, or pity. I accepted none. I let the dawn carry the shape of what had been done. When I walked back into my house the next day, neighbors had left notes and casseroles. Margot sat with a thermos on the kitchen table. Len had fixed the hinges of the old gate that had squealed in every storm. The pear tree had dropped blossoms like confetti across the lawn where a futon had once been. I should have felt triumph then, sweeter perhaps, than any dessert at that wedding. I felt something else, a hollow, growing and patient. Because I knew Damien. I had seen the way he moved, the way predators do when they are denied dinner. He would not forgive easily. He would not simply go on marrying and dancing. He was the kind of man who built grudges like houses, with foundation and beam and a foundation of angry payments. That night, as I lay in bed while my house creaked like an old ship and the pear tree tapped its branches at the window, I listened for the sound I knew might come. I had done something bold. I had reclaimed what was mine. But revenge, even when justified, is a story that calls for more than a single chapter. It calls for endurance. It calls for patience and iron. A week later, Damien's friends began to appear in town. A man with a heavy coat I did not recognize took photographs of the house from across the street. Someone left a pamphlet on my front step about a class action suit for wrongful eviction. My phone lit up with calls from blocked numbers that made no sound when I answered. A neighbor's gutter was slashed in the night. The lights in my yard went out once, then flickered on again. I paid them no mind most nights, but I felt the shape of danger like a hand in my hair. Clarissa called twice. The first time she cried and asked if she could come by for coffee. The second time she spasmed with anger and said I had ruined her life. "You made us homeless," she shouted. "You humiliated us in front of everyone." She hung up before I could answer. Humiliated, I thought, tracing the word with my finger like a stone. Yes. Humiliated by a slap. But what of the man who struck me? Who struck his mother-in-law? I had been the one who tasted humiliation. I had been the one who had to sleep with the knowledge that the world could be cruel. I had also been the one who had lived long enough to know what liberty could look like. Ownership, not of houses only, but of voice and choice. I reclaimed a house that was mine. If that felt like vengeance to them, perhaps they would learn to call kindness by another word. That night, in the margin of my notebook where I had written grocery lists and prayer requests for years, I penned one more item. Keep watch. Keep friends. Keep story. Then, just as I closed my eyes, there came a car door slam, close enough to make my window rattle. A silhouette stood under the streetlight, hands in pockets, a hat pulled low. The car idled and then moved away, leaving me with a thread of unease that hummed under my ribs like an insect. I could not know then whether it was worry or announcement. I slept with the curtains drawn tight. A week after that, the lights on my porch went out and someone hammered on my door at midnight. I opened the peephole and saw nothing but a pair of shoes and the shadow of a person who did not belong. The knock came again, a measured, deliberate sound. I stood behind the door and listened. A voice called my name in a tone that meant business and threats wrapped in velvet. Eleanor Mayfield, the voice said. You may have your deeds, but you'll learn. There are ways to make you regret nights like this. I felt the same thing I felt the night Damien struck me, a cold that began in the throat and rooted itself in my bones. That chill said to me that this story was no longer about eviction or title or money. It was about survival. My house had always been shelter and story. Now it would be a battleground. But if they wanted war, then let them come. I had survived hurricanes, hospital night shifts, and the death of a husband who had loved me in fits and starts. I had elbowed my way through life with brooms and small coins and an unshakable belief that the world can be rearranged. I had taken back the key. I would not be bullied into silence a second time. And so the night closed around me, and the pears on the tree smelled like forgiveness and danger. I sat by the window and watched the road, and for the first time in my life, planned not only how to keep what was mine, but how to make those who hurt me understand exactly what it feels like to have the ground beneath them taken away. After the porch light went out and the shadowy threats arrived, I realized that defending the house would require more than stubbornness and a good locksmith. It would need planning, alliances, and a careful understanding of the small laws and larger habits that people forget when they trust their anger more than their sense. I started with paperwork. Paperwork had been my companion for decades. Warranty cards tucked in drawers, certificates folded in cookbooks, receipts taped behind calendars. For years I had kept everything because it seemed useless to throw away proof, and because proof can be a kind of armor. I spent one rainy morning at my kitchen table, moving through the drawers like a careful archaeologist. I pulled out the original deed to the house. It was older than some of the neighbors. The stamp was still crisp. I hired a young paralegal named June to help organize the files. She was the granddaughter of a woman I had once cared for at the hospital. June had a mind like a calculator and a kindness like a lamp. She sorted the documents into folders labeled clearly: deed, taxes, payment history, utility bills, improvements. Each folder was a small fortress. We created electronic copies and sent them to a secure email account I kept only for important things. The little fortress began to bulk. Next, I turned to neighbors. Humans are social animals. They gossip, they watch, and they remember. I walked up and down Maple Hollow and knocked on doors like a woman who carried casseroles and secrets. People were willing to listen. There was Mrs. Danvers from 2 houses down who had watched Clarissa as a child. There was Henry who kept bees and had seen Damien's friends linger in his yard late at night. There was a teenager named Aisha whose mother ran the bakery and who had taken to delivering fresh rolls and news when she felt someone needed a lift. They remembered small things I needed: dates, faces, the nights when lights flickered and a truck idled too long. Then I looked to the web of credits and bills. I called the cable company, the internet provider, and the contractor who had installed the new roof 2 summers ago. When I told them I needed proof for a civil dispute, they were mostly obliging. Companies keep records like hoarders keep trinkets. Sometimes they are helpful and sometimes they are not. I copied contracts and receipts that named me or referenced improvements I had paid for. Those papers were mundane, stamped invoices and polite letters, but they were also armor. All of this, I realized, was a slow gathering of texture. A man who thought he could burn me with one violent act did not expect a paper trail to sting him later. He had relied on the speed of his temper and the cowardice of those who would look the other way. He did not have an army of people who remembered small things the way I did. I also started to watch them. Not in a way that was cruel or dangerous, only like a patient gardener watches for blight. I learned Damien's patterns. He liked to drive early in the morning, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. He met someone once a week at a coffee shop outside of town. He called his mother on Sundays, his voice honeyed and thin with obligation. I drove past the coffee shop one afternoon and watched him through a plate glass window as he laughed easily at a woman with red hair. He looked untroubled, like a man unaccustomed to consequence. One of my best moves, though, was something simple. I reached out to the bank where Damien had recently taken a loan to pay for a business venture. I did not threaten. I merely introduced myself and asked some small questions that made the clerk check the notes internally. I had prepared a letter from a lawyer, a short, professional thing saying I was considering legal remedies if they did not resolve a tenancy dispute. The bank, which does not like messy family dramas on its records, took the hint. Quiet pressure goes a long way against prideful bluster. I also called a reporter from the local paper and told a small slice of the story. I was careful. I did not invent. I said, an elderly homeowner removed her adult daughter and son-in-law from her property after an incident at a wedding. The reporter filed it under human interest. The next morning a short column titled, Elderly Widow Reclaims Home After Wedding Bust-Up, printed with a photograph of my porch and a caption that made Clarissa blush. Media can be a friend. It turns shame back upon those who hope to hide it. A city councilwoman I had met at a town ceremony recommended a mediator. There are always two sides, she told me over tea. But sometimes one side forgets what's right. The mediator was a practical woman who understood how people behave when they are cornered. She suggested we attempt negotiation before the courts did the slow work they are named for. Her office set up a meeting, and I prepared like a soldier preparing for a parley, folding documents, rehearsing words I wanted to say without heat. Still, for every rational step I took, Damien responded in ways that were childish and sharp. He painted me in private messages as an angry old woman who had stolen from her own child. He told friends that I was manipulative and greedy. But behind whispers and barstool stories lies a truth I have seen my whole life. The louder someone screams about being wronged, the more likely they try to cover the fact that they know when they have done wrong. There was one night when the pressure turned hot. A truck circled the block 3 times and then revved loudly as if to announce presence. A brick hit my porch window and left a jagged star of glass. Someone left a bag of dog excrement on my doormat at dawn. Small things, menacing in accumulation. I called the police, filed an incident report, and the officer advised cameras. I bought 2 security cameras that could connect to my phone. June helped me set them up, and they streamed that same night when headlights moved slowly down the street and a shadow lingered against my fence. The footage gave me a small, steady heart, proof that the threats were not only in my head. Tony, a heavy-set fellow who once worked salvage and had the easiest laugh in town, came by one afternoon and sat at my kitchen table. They don't like to lose face, he said, cutting his fingers through the steam of his coffee. They'll try to rattle you till you hand it back. I let him say his piece. I did not enjoy the taste of threats in my ear, but threats had a way of sharpening the next move. Then came a day that surprised me. Clarissa knocked on my door, not with the voice of a child pleading, but with something thin and fragile that had been worn down by life. "Mom," she said, "can we talk?" The mediator had set a meeting and suggested we all sit down. I agreed, but my condition was clear: honesty and presence. No insults, no dramatics. We met in a conference room with neutral chairs and a pot of watered flowers in the center. Clarissa arrived in a simple dress, the kind that used to belong to the girl who loved to bake, and Damien came with his mouth closed like a man without appetite. The mediator asked each of us to speak. My hands were steady as I told our story, what had happened at the wedding, the slap, the shame, the eviction. I read from a small stack of notes so my voice would not wobble on memory. Clarissa began to cry. I was embarrassed, she said, small and ashamed. I didn't want people to see my family messy. I wanted perfection. She looked not at Damien but at me. I was scared of being judged. I am sorry. Damien, who had been leaning back and watching me like an actor who had lost his monologue, finally spoke. I was wrong, he muttered. It was not the theatrical apology of a man on television. It was a small, fumbling attempt at ownership. For a moment I believed it could be the start of repair. We worked out terms. They would pay me back for utilities and agreed to vacate within 30 days. There would be a written acknowledgement of my ownership. In return, I would not pursue criminal charges over the slap if they agreed to counseling and to reimburse certain expenses. We signed papers. The mediator stamped them and shook our hands. Outside, the press had a polite field day about closure and reconciliation. I went home feeling both relieved and wary. Reconciliation is a delicate truce. It does not erase the memory of violence. It places it like a stone in a pocket and asks you to carry on. That night, when I locked my doors, I felt the weight of that stone. As the days passed and the couple prepared to leave, I watched them downsize with a strange feeling. I felt no joy in watching their boxes pile on a truck. Hunger and revenge share a lineage sometimes, but triumph tastes thin when it is served cold. What comforted me was not the eviction but the knowledge that I had stood up. That knowledge was worth more than any casserole left on my porch. And yet, I knew that life does not stop after a parley. Men like Damien resent being shown the law. They nurse their anger like children nurse wounds. So I kept my folders ready, my cameras rolling, and my list of witnesses at hand. I had reclaimed my house, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my voice. There are people in the world who think old women should be small and pliant. I have spent my life proving them wrong. I did not want ruin. I wanted respect. And if respect required evidence, patience, and a willingness to be loud in the right rooms, then I would be loud. Tonight, as I close my folder and place the last affidavit into a cabinet, I can hear the faint sound of a truck down the block. I stand by the window and watch headlights move. I do not know if this story is done. I know only that I will not be silent again. Always. The night after that awful wedding replayed in my mind like a broken record. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's hand striking my face, the burning sting that followed, and the silence from everyone, especially from my own daughter, Clara. She didn't even flinch. She didn't even try to defend me. Instead, she told me to sit down like I was a child who had misbehaved. I didn't sleep much. My house was quiet, but my heart was roaring. At 76 years old, I thought I had endured enough of life's humiliations. Losing my husband, raising my children alone, working 2 jobs just to keep the roof over our heads. But nothing prepared me for the pain of being betrayed by my own flesh and blood. The next morning, I stood by my kitchen window, staring at the bright sun shining over my little garden. My hands trembled as I held my cup of tea. Normally, mornings calmed me. But that morning, my chest was tight. I could still hear the whispers of the wedding guests, their judgmental eyes darting my way, their smirks as if I was nothing but a nuisance. And yet, deep down, a strange calm began to wash over me. It wasn't weakness. It was clarity. Something inside whispered, "You don't have to take this anymore." I sat down at the kitchen table with my notebook, the same notebook I had used for grocery lists and knitting patterns. But this time, I wrote 3 simple words: make them pay. That entire day, I moved like a ghost. The phone rang a few times, neighbors calling to check on me, after what they saw at the wedding. I didn't answer. I couldn't bear to hear their pity or their fake concern. Instead, I made myself busy. I walked through the old family photo albums. Pictures of Clara as a baby, her first steps, her graduation. Each photo stabbed me in the heart. How had the sweet girl in those pictures turned into the cold woman who sided with her husband over her own mother? The more I stared at those photos, the more I realized something. I had given Clara everything. My savings, my time, my sacrifices. I had even signed part of my property into her name because I thought she would take care of me when I grew old. Now I saw it all as a mistake. That night, I pulled out the wooden box hidden under my bed. Inside were documents most people didn't know about. Deeds, savings accounts, and letters from lawyers from years ago. My husband, God rest his soul, had left more behind than anyone realized. And suddenly, I knew exactly what I needed to do. The following weekend, Clara and Ethan came by my house. They walked in like they owned the place, not even knocking. Clara went straight to the kitchen, opening my fridge like she lived there. Ethan dropped himself on my couch, scrolling through his phone, not even looking at me. "You should have behaved better at the wedding," Clara said casually as she poured herself orange juice. "You embarrassed us. Guests are still talking." Her words cut deeper than any knife. I stood in the doorway, staring at her. "I embarrassed you? Clara, your husband hit me in front of everyone. And you told me to shut up." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being dramatic, Mom. You know Ethan didn't mean it that way. You should have just let things go." I felt my whole body trembling, not from fear this time, but from rage. Ethan finally looked up from his phone. His smirk made me sick. "You know, Margaret," he said, "maybe it's time you started respecting boundaries. You live too much in our lives. Clara and I are married adults now. You need to step back and stop acting like you still run things." My lips curled into a cold smile. "Is that so?" "Yes," he said with confidence. "You should be grateful we even invite you to things anymore. Most people your age are already rotting away in nursing homes." The audacity. My blood boiled, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I quietly said, "You're right. Maybe I've been too involved. But don't worry, I won't be a burden for much longer." They smirked, thinking they had won. They had no idea what storm was about to hit them. The very next day, I visited an old lawyer friend of mine, Mr. Douglas. He was retired now, but he owed me a favor. Years ago, I had cared for his wife when she was ill, cooking meals and checking in when no one else did. He welcomed me into his home, his kind eyes still sharp. "Margaret," he said, "I haven't seen you in years. What brings you here?" I took a deep breath and told him everything, from the wedding incident to Clara and Ethan's arrogance. When I finished, I pulled out my documents from the wooden box. "I want to change everything. Every will, every deed, every piece of paper they think they own. I want it all back under my control." Mr. Douglas nodded slowly, flipping through the documents. "You were wise to keep these. Most people your age don't think ahead like this." "I'm not most people," I said firmly. By the time I left his home, I had a new will drafted, new property protections in place, and instructions ready to be executed if Clara and Ethan dared to cross me again. I walked out of his house taller than I had in years. But revenge, I realized, wasn't just about legal papers. I wanted them to feel what I felt. I wanted them to know what it was like to be humiliated and abandoned. So I started small. I called the bank and froze the joint account Clara thought she had access to. She had no idea I still controlled the bulk of the money. I also called the landlord of the apartment Clara and Ethan rented. The apartment, as it turned out, was still under my name from years ago when I helped Clara move in after college. The landlord was shocked to hear from me. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "are you saying you want to revoke their lease?" "Yes," I replied calmly. "They have until the end of the month. If they don't leave, I'll file for eviction." I could almost hear the gasp through the phone. When I hung up, I felt no guilt. Not a shred. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But little did I know, Clara and Ethan were about to find out faster than I planned. Because 2 days later, they showed up at my doorstep, furious, desperate, and ready for war. If you felt the fire building inside me in this chapter, wait until you see what happens when they realize the truth. Stay with me, because the storm has only just begun. The pounding on my front door rattled the glass panes. I knew it was them. Only Clara and Ethan banged like that, demanding, entitled, as if the whole world owed them entry. I opened the door slowly. Clara's face was red, her eyes wild with anger. Ethan stood behind her, his jaw clenched, gripping his phone like he was ready to record some kind of showdown. "Mom!" Clara shouted, pushing past me into the living room. "What the hell did you do?" "The landlord just called. He said we're being kicked out by the end of the month." "Tell me it's not true." I closed the door quietly and leaned on it, watching them unravel. "It's true," I said evenly. "The apartment is in my name. Always has been. I decided it's time you both find your own way." Ethan's face twisted in disbelief. "Are you insane, old woman? You can't just." "I can," I interrupted sharply. "And I did." Clara whirled around, her hands trembling. "Why would you do this to us? We're your family." The word family, coming out of her mouth, nearly made me laugh. Family doesn't let a husband slap his mother-in-law in public. Family doesn't tell their mother to shut up in front of wedding guests. Family, I said coldly. You stopped being my family the moment you humiliated me at that wedding. You both made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Ethan took a step closer, towering over me like he thought his size could scare me. "Listen here, Margaret. You think you're clever? You think you can ruin us? You're nothing but an old hag. If you don't fix this, you'll regret it." His voice was low, threatening, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I smiled. "I already regret giving you a place to sleep. I regret raising Clara to believe she could walk all over me. But do you know what I don't regret? Taking back what's mine." Clara's lips quivered. She wasn't used to seeing me like this. Calm, strong, unshaken. "You can't do this," she whispered. "We'll have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem," I said, turning my back on them. "Now get out of my house." They didn't leave quietly. Clara sobbed, begging me to reconsider. Ethan cursed, calling me names I wouldn't dare repeat. But eventually, they stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frames rattled on the wall. I sank onto the couch, breathing deeply. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. This time it was from power. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my own life. But I also knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, I walked into the bank downtown. The young teller looked surprised when I handed her my identification and asked to review my accounts. "Mrs. Harper," she said politely, "your daughter Clara has been accessing funds from this account regularly. Are you looking to—" "Yes," I interrupted. "Freeze every account with her name on it. Immediately. She is no longer authorized." The teller hesitated. "But she's listed as a secondary." "Not anymore," I said firmly, sliding the legal papers Mr. Douglas had drawn up across the counter. "Here's proof of the new arrangements." Her eyes widened. "Oh, I see. We'll make the changes right away." As I left the bank, a weight lifted off my shoulders. I thought about every paycheck I had worked for, every night I had gone without so Clara could have what she wanted. Now finally, those sacrifices were no longer in her careless hands. That evening, Clara called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice was shrill through the receiver. "Mom, what did you do? My card got declined at the grocery store. Ethan and I had to leave a cart full of food. Do you know how humiliating that was?" I almost laughed at the irony. Humiliation. Now she knew how it felt. "Consider it practice," I said. "You'll be living without my money from now on." Her tone turned bitter. "I can't believe you would do this to your own daughter." "You stopped being my daughter when you chose him over me," I replied and hung up. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd heard in years. Days turned into weeks. Word spread quickly around town. Neighbors who once pitied me at the wedding now whispered a different story. They said Margaret Harper wasn't weak after all. She was a storm. But Clara and Ethan? Their lives started crumbling. I heard from a friend at church that they had been spotted fighting outside their apartment building. With the eviction notice looming, they were desperate. Ethan had tried to sweet-talk the landlord, but when he realized the lease was still under my control, his charm turned into rage. Clara, on the other hand, looked thinner, more worn out. I could picture her sleepless nights, the tears she thought no one saw. Part of me ached to see my daughter suffer. But another part whispered, she made her bed. Now she must lie in it. One Friday evening, I was knitting by the fire when headlights flashed through my window. Moments later, the sound of a car door slamming echoed down the driveway. I knew it was them before they even knocked. This time, they didn't storm in. They stood on the porch, drenched from the rain, looking less like conquerors and more like beggars. I opened the door but didn't invite them inside. "Mom," Clara's voice cracked. "Please. We have nowhere else to go. Just give us some time. Just a little help." I looked at her, water dripping down her face, mascara smeared. Behind her, Ethan stood scowling, his pride refusing to let him speak. I thought of the nights I had stayed awake, worrying if Clara had enough food during college. The years I spent working double shifts just so she could wear decent clothes to school. The countless times I sacrificed for her happiness. And now here she was, on my doorstep, begging, after throwing me away. "No," I said quietly. "Not this time." Her eyes widened. "Mom, please." I shook my head. "You chose him. You chose humiliation over love. And now you both will live with the consequences." I started to close the door, but Ethan suddenly shoved his foot in the frame, his eyes blazing. "You can't do this to us. We'll take you to court." I stared at him coldly. "Do it. You'll lose. I have every document, every signature, every law on my side. You'll end up with less than nothing." For a moment, silence hung between us, the storm outside roaring louder than our breaths. Then, slowly, I pushed the door shut against his foot. He resisted, but I leaned all my weight into it until he finally stumbled back. The door clicked shut. The lock turned. And I stood there in the quiet, my chest rising and falling. They were out. Completely out. But as I leaned against the door, my heart whispered something unexpected. This isn't over. Not yet. The real storm is still coming. The following week, I expected peace. I thought that once Clara and Ethan realized I meant every word, they would finally leave me alone. But I was wrong. Their desperation only grew. And desperate people do reckless things. It was late Sunday evening. The church bells had long stopped ringing, and I was settling into my chair with a warm blanket when I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then came the crunch of footsteps on gravel. My heart stiffened. I peered through the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see. There they were, Clara and Ethan, sneaking around my house like thieves. Clara clutched a bag, Ethan's face twisted with anger. My stomach dropped. What were they doing here? I didn't turn on the lights. I moved silently, watching as they circled toward the back door. That's when I heard the faint jingle, the sound of a spare key being used. My chest tightened. Years ago, I had given Clara a spare key in case of emergencies. I had forgotten to change the locks. The door creaked open. My own daughter and her husband stepped into my kitchen like strangers in the night. "Ethan, hurry," Clara whispered. "She keeps cash in that box under her bed." The words hit me like a knife. My daughter knew where I kept my savings. She wasn't here to talk. She was here to rob me. My body froze, torn between rage and heartbreak. I stepped into the hallway, my voice steady. Looking for something. They both whipped around. Clara's eyes went wide, her face pale. Ethan snarled. Mom, Clara stammered. We. Save it, I said coldly. I heard everything. Ethan stepped forward, his voice sharp. You don't understand. We need money. You left us with nothing. You left me with nothing the moment you raised your hand to me, Ethan. And you, Clara. I turned to my daughter, my voice breaking. You left me the moment you told me to shut up at your own wedding. Tears filled Clara's eyes, but she didn't move. She didn't apologize. Instead, she looked at me like a stranger, caught in her own shame. Get out, I whispered. But Ethan didn't move. His chest heaved as his fists clenched. No. We're not leaving without something. That's when I realized just how far he was willing to go. I had always been small, fragile-looking. But I wasn't defenseless. Not anymore. Slowly, I reached into the drawer by the hallway table and pulled out the item I had placed there weeks ago, just in case. A heavy flashlight, thick and metal. I held it firmly in my hands. My voice didn't waver. Touch anything in this house, and you'll regret it. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Ethan laughed, low and cruel. What are you going to do, old woman? Hit me with a flashlight. I didn't blink. Try me. The air grew heavy. Even Clara looked stunned, glancing nervously between us. She whispered, Ethan, let's just go. But Ethan didn't back down. He took another step closer, towering over me, his eyes burning with hatred. You think you can ruin our lives and get away with it? You think this is over? It's not over until I say so. I lifted the flashlight higher. Get out. Finally, Clara grabbed his arm, her voice desperate. Please, Ethan. Let's go. After a long pause, he cursed under his breath, yanked his arm away, and stormed toward the door. Clara followed, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't wipe away. The door slammed behind them, and I stood there trembling, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. That night, I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind raced. I had crossed into dangerous territory. Ethan wasn't just arrogant. He was dangerous. And Clara was caught in his shadow, too weak to stand against him. I sat in my living room, staring at the dark ceiling, and one thought echoed louder than the rest. They won't stop until I stop them. The next morning, I returned to Mr. Douglas, the retired lawyer. I told him everything. The break-in, the threats, the robbery attempt. His expression darkened. Margaret, he said firmly, you need protection. I can help file restraining orders. And if they come near you again, you call the police immediately. Don't hesitate. For years, I had been hesitant. I had forgiven too easily, let things slide too quickly. But not anymore. Do it, I told him. File whatever needs to be filed. I want them nowhere near me or my property. When I returned home, my phone buzzed. A text message. It was from Clara. Mom, I'm sorry about last night. Ethan just gets stressed. Please don't take this to the police. We just need time to fix things. Please don't hate me. I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart aching. It was the closest thing to an apology I had heard from her in years. But even then, it wasn't a true apology. It was an excuse. I didn't reply. 2 days later, a sheriff knocked on their apartment door and handed Ethan the papers. Restraining orders. Eviction confirmation. Legal walls they couldn't climb over. I heard from neighbors that Ethan had exploded in anger, throwing chairs, shouting threats about me. But the law was clear. They were finished. Or so I thought. Friday evening, I lit candles in my living room, the soft glow dancing across the walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of peace. But just as I sipped my tea, I heard another sound. A car engine idling outside. Then the unmistakable crunch of boots on my driveway. I froze. My curtains swayed with the draft, and shadows passed across the porch. They were back. And this time I sensed, they weren't just here to beg. They were here for something darker. The night air was heavy, thick with dread. I sat frozen in my chair, my teacup trembling in my hands as I listened to the crunch of footsteps on my driveway. Through the window, I saw them. Ethan leading the way, his broad shoulders hunched with anger, and Clara trailing behind him, her face pale in the porch light. They didn't knock this time. Ethan's fist pounded the door once, hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Margaret," he roared. "Open this door now." I didn't move. My heart raced, but my body stayed still. The second pound shook the wood. Clara's voice followed, shaky but pleading. "Mom, please, just talk to us. Please." I tightened my grip on the flashlight I had kept nearby since their last intrusion. My mind spun. Should I call the police? Or should I face them head-on? Before I could decide, Ethan's voice cut through the air like a blade. "If you don't open this door, I'll break it down." That was enough. My fear hardened into steel. I rose to my feet, unlocked the door, and swung it open wide. There they stood, Ethan with fury in his eyes, Clara with tears streaking down her face. "You think you can hide behind your little papers and lawyers?" Ethan spat. "You can't ruin us like this. You owe us." I stepped into the doorway, my voice calm but sharp. "I don't owe you a single thing. I gave you everything already." You threw it back in my face. Clara reached for me. "Mom, please." But Ethan shoved past her, storming into my living room like he owned it. He glanced around, eyes narrowing as if searching for valuables to take. "This house, this money, it should be ours. You're too old to need any of this. You should be in a home by now." The audacity sent fire through my veins. "This home is mine," I snapped. "Every brick, every nail, every dollar. And I'll be damned if I let you steal it from me." Ethan turned, his face twisted in rage. "You think you're untouchable, old woman?" He lunged forward, his hand reaching for me. For a split second, I saw the same fury from the wedding, the same hand that had struck me in front of hundreds. But this time, I wasn't helpless. I swung the flashlight with every ounce of strength in my body. The metal connected with his arm, and he howled in pain, stumbling backward. Clara screamed. "Ethan, stop." But Ethan wasn't done. He straightened, clutching his arm, his eyes burning. "You'll regret that." Before he could step closer, I raised the flashlight again, steady and unwavering. "One more move, and you'll leave here in an ambulance." For the first time, he hesitated. He saw it in my eyes. I wasn't bluffing. Clara pulled at his arm, sobbing. "Ethan, please. Let's just go." He glared at me for a long, tense moment, his chest rising and falling with rage. Finally, he spat on the floor and stormed toward the door. Clara followed, her cries echoing through the night. The door slammed shut, rattling the walls. I stood there, breathing hard, my hands trembling around the flashlight. My body ached, but my spirit blazed. I had stood my ground. But deep inside, I knew something terrifying. Ethan wouldn't stop. Not until he destroyed me. The next morning, I drove to the police station. The young officer at the front desk looked startled as I placed my written report on the counter. "They broke into my home again," I said firmly. "They threatened me. And this time I fought back." The officer skimmed the report, his eyes widening. "Ma'am, this is serious. With the restraining order already in place, they could face jail time for this." "Good. I said coldly. Maybe a cell will teach them respect. He nodded. We'll increase patrols near your home. If they come back, call us immediately. Don't open the door again. For the first time, I felt the weight of the law on my side. Not just papers, but real protection. But Clara. That night, as I sat in the quiet, my phone buzzed with a new message. It wasn't Ethan this time. It was her. Mom. I don't know what to do. I love him, but he's getting worse. I don't even recognize him anymore. Please. I don't want to lose you too. I stared at the screen, my heart twisting. Was this a cry for help, or another manipulation? My fingers hovered over the keys, but I didn't reply. Not yet. I couldn't trust her, not while Ethan still controlled her every move. 2 days later, I was returning from the grocery store when I noticed something strange. My mailbox hung open, its lock broken. Inside, my letters were gone. Bills, bank statements, everything missing. I knew instantly who had done it. Ethan wasn't just desperate. He was reckless enough to steal from my mailbox. My stomach turned cold. This wasn't just about humiliation anymore. This was war. That night, I couldn't shake the thought. How far will he go? Would he vandalize my home? Drain my accounts? Hurt me? I checked the locks on every door twice, then pulled a chair under the handle of my bedroom door. I kept the flashlight by my side and a phone in my hand. The wind howled outside, branches scratching against the windows. Every creak of the house made me jump. I whispered a prayer into the darkness. Lord, give me strength. I am not ready to fall. And as I drifted into restless sleep, a new thought came to me. Terrifying but clear. Maybe it wasn't enough to defend myself. Maybe it was time to strike first. If you felt the tension rising here, stay with me. Because in the next part, I won't just defend myself, I'll take action. And the consequences will shake everything.